Okay, so today's the last time we actually gather in the morning together. So I know Annette has a few things to say to you after this morning's proceedings. But I will invite Professor Martin Mills up to the stage, and he will introduce our final keynote speaker, Professor Greg Noble. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. I too would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people in whose land we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also to acknowledge that I've learnt so much from many of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've been part of AARE during my presidency and time on the executive. I do just want to say a few words about context. Yesterday in the Senate, during the reading of the same-sex marriage debate legislation, George Brandis made this comment: "These late spring and early summer days of 2017 will always be remembered as a time when the Parliament heeded the wishes of the overwhelming majority of Australians, that ours should be a society defined by greater decency, truer equality and more perfect freedom." And I do think there's a lot of positives around the same-sex marriage postal survey, and it has demonstrated, as Noel Pearson indicated in his withering attack on Malcolm Turnbull on a Radio National interview, that the silent majority may not be quite as mean-spirited as many think. And as celebrations go, for me, these late spring and early summer days of 2017 will always be remembered for when our disgraceful refugee policy of many years culminated in the horrors taking place on Manus Island. For me, underpinning this treatment is a fear of multiculturalism and a deep-seated Islamophobia in our society. I think it's worth reading the article that's in today's Guardian by David Marr that reports on the Scanlon Foundation's Mapping Social Cohesion, that Australia still embraces multiculturalism, but fracture lines are deepening. In my view, it's incumbent upon educators to speak up against these atrocities, such as occurring on Manus Island, and the evidence of Islamophobia and racism in our society. I think Greg Noble is someone who has long been doing this work. His books, Bin Laden in the Suburbs, On Being Lebanese in Australia, Cultural Pedagogies and Human Conduct, all tackle issues of racism and Islamophobia. I'm very much looking forward to his upcoming book, Multicultural Education for a Culturally Complex World, Doing Diversity Differently. In an academic world concerned with impact, I can't be more pleased that academics such as Greg are having an impact, as he's done through his work with the New South Wales Department of Education, through SBS and through the Human Rights Commission. In my former role as president of AARE, I lost count of the number of times I had to say, "It is my pleasure." But in my last official task as immediate past president, I couldn't be more enthusiastic in saying, "It is my great pleasure to welcome Greg Noble to the stage to present his keynote today." Thank you, Greg.
Well, it's an even greater pleasure to be here, and I thank the organisers for inviting me and giving me this chance to talk to such a large gathering. So, PowerPoint's up. So I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that this event is taking place on. I'd also like to acknowledge my ancestors and your ancestors and the places that they come from and the places they've journeyed to. I'd like to also acknowledge the injustices that have caused many to leave their homes. And I'd like to honour the courage that it takes to make a new world and to honour the courage to welcome newcomers. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to talk about a project that I've been working on for the last few years There we go. With a team of researchers including Megan Watkins, Kevin Dunn, and our partners, the New South Wales Department of Education and the then New South Wales Institute of Teachers. We've changed their name a few times and been sucked up into other things. And it's a project called Rethinking Multiculturalism, Reassessing Multicultural Education. And it grew out of a previous research project that we'd been doing in New South Wales with the New South Wales Department of Education, which I think kind of went through a few name changes, but it was eventually published as a book called Disposed to Learn, where we were looking at the experiences of Chinese background, Pacific Islander background, and white Australian background students in the schooling system. And one of the things that kind of came up for us in that project was the way that, as long-time supporters of multiculturalism, it had nevertheless kind of become reified in certain circumstances and often engaged in particularly essentialised understandings of ethnicity. So we wanted to kind of develop a project which was not just research on something, but actually was about looking at ways schools and teachers in particular responded to what we were kind of posing as the challenges for schooling in the 21st century around issues of cultural diversity, or as we like to reframe it, a question of cultural complexity. So the aim, as indicated there, was to examine whether multicultural education can address these challenges of an increasingly culturally complex world. We do so in the context, not just coming out of the project, we were kind of anxious about the way things were getting done in schools, in some schools, but because, as we all know, there's been mounting criticism of multiculturalism as a broad philosophy, and also as particular kinds of practices in places like schools. Mounting criticism not just from the right and kind of the push back against multiculturalism and declining funding and kind of conservative critiques of multiculturalism, but also from concerned educators, often from the left, who were concerned that multiculturalism generally and multicultural education in particular had kind of fallen into a hole and wasn't really kind of keeping abreast with the changes that were happening in globalised world that we live in. But there's also been long-standing critiques, as I'm sure you're all aware, of the problems of multiculturalism and the fact that in many ways it's often masking inequalities around ethnicity, class, sometimes gender, and that it could also take on a very strong moralising tone in the way it played out in schools. So there was lots of criticisms, and it seemed like a kind of a good moment to think about, in this particular context, do we need to rethink multiculturalism generally and multicultural education in particular? So we tried to do a couple of things. The first was really to map the languages of multiculturalism. And you'll see why that becomes important as we kind of proceed. To look at the kind of the key words that people use when they talk about the world as it is. Categories of culture, ethnicity, new categories like intercultural understanding that we've already heard some people talk about at the conference so far already, as well as multiculturalism itself. And we wanted to get those kinds of understandings from students and teachers and the school community, the parents and so on. We also, within that kind of context, that kind of mapping of the language of multiculturalism, we wanted to get some sense of the perspectives on multicultural education, you know, what people thought it was about and whether it was working and whether it was any good. But we also wanted to capture something of the complexity of the world that these programs were taking place in and their implications for schools. And most importantly, and what I want to spend some time talking about in the last third or so of the presentation, is that we actually want to kind of set up a kind of a challenge to schools to undertake their own action research projects in response to what we were saying was the challenges to the way we think about the world. So, and I'll explain that in a second. So the methodology is fairly simple. We did a very large statewide survey of teachers a couple of years ago. It actually hadn't been done before. So, and we had a pretty good response rate. just under 10%, and it was an electronic survey, so pretty good sample, we thought. I'm not going to talk a lot about the survey. There are a couple of things that I'll pull out of it, but it was actually a really kind of important thing to kind of get kind of a benchmarking of teachers' experiences, their views on particular aspects of multiculturalism, schooling and multicultural education, their understandings of particular kinds of aspects of multiculturalism, and a whole range of other kind of quite interesting things. But as I said, I won't get a chance to talk at length about the survey. But we also worked with the Department of Education to identify 14 schools that we would do the action research projects in. And initially we ran a series of focus group discussions with students, parents and teachers in those schools, meeting a broad range of kind of profiles, whether they actually had a high Labote or low Labote population, whether they were city-based or regional, and their class background. And also within the action research process, the schools picked teams of 5 people, and we also engaged in interviews with them, engaged in observations with aspects of the school, that it wasn't as an intense and observational process as the previous project had been, and analysis of the kinds of documents that they circulated. And but the important point is that the action research was premised on the professional learning that we offered. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Probably a bit tedious, but it's kind of important to know that we were kind of setting up a challenge to these schools and framing it in a particular way. And we framed it through a series of sessions at the beginning of the action research process and in the middle of the action research process, where we asked teachers to undertake a number of readings, not a lot, and we'll come back to that right at the end of the presentation. A kind of a series of lectures or seminars, some group activities, and we also fed into the professional learning findings from the survey and also some of the data that we'd actually started to collect in the process and from the previous project. The schools had teams of 5 people, as I said. They were generously funded by the New South Wales Department of Education so they could come along and do the training and without any major disruption to the schools. Because it took, as we said from the beginning, it will take a lot of time. This is not just a kind of a whip in, whip out kind of thing. And the professional learning was structured around 4 kind of key areas. As I've already indicated, one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing was to examine keywords. I come partly from a cultural studies background where we kind of fetishise the idea of the keyword and spend a lot of time talking about the words that we use. And the argument being, of course, that words matter. Words have effect. They aren't just representations. They inform practice. They are a practice in themselves, and they are part of the way things get done in schools. We also spent some time revisiting the goals and practices of multicultural education, but we wanted to reframe that in terms of what we call the logics of multicultural education. And this is a really important idea for us because we argued that, as you'll see, multiculturalism is a very complex idea. It means lots of things to many people, and it means kind of contradictory things. And people have pointed that out as a kind of a form of philosophical critique many times. Our point is that multiculturalism does different kinds of things, and they are in competition. And they can be broadly understood in terms of questions of access and equity, ESL classes, recognition and cultural maintenance kinds of activities, community languages programs and so on. And questions of social cohesion and intercultural relations, anti-racism, parent liaison, and so on and so forth. And that they are different kinds of logics for schooling action, okay? And as I'll come to in a minute, they actually kind of pull schools in different ways. But we also wanted to kind of reframe that in terms of what we've talked about as the cultural complexity of contemporary societies, and to talk about multiculturalism not simply in terms of dealing with Labote communities, but thinking about it in the broader context of the flows of people around the world. What happens when migration kind of shifts not just the dynamics of the society, the host society, but what happens to the category of ethnicity when people move around the world and settle, and so on and so forth. And to think about these things not just in terms of the practicalities of dealing with a particular classroom where you might have 5 kids of Arabic-speaking background, but in a broader kind of global context. And we did this also in terms of kind of an argument about the need for action research, not to be just kind of a practical thing where teachers did stuff and thought about it, but where it had to be kind of theoretically informed with a clear sense of a particular kind of research question that it was engaging in, and where one had to kind of think about reading literature and developing methods that were appropriate to answering the questions. We had a bunch of questions that informed our kind of argument around the logics of multiculturalism, and which we kind of fed to the teachers and kind of discussed with them at various stages. And they were things like, how do schools implement programs which follow competing logics, okay? And how do schools prioritise what they need to do? Given the scarce resources, what do I put my money into? It can be very pragmatically, but it's also questions of time. Do I pull kids out of the maths class to do a community language class, and so on and so forth? But also, are the goals of multicultural education actually shared by teachers and students and parents? And what do you do when they aren't? Or how do you find out whether they are or aren't? And what exactly are the cultures that should be recognised and maintained through schooling, if that's an important focus of the school's understanding of multiculturalism? And importantly, do the assumptions about, that are built into multicultural policies in Australia since the 70s actually match the lives of students and others? And of course, are teachers and schools prepared well enough to address the kinds of demands that we're making of them? So the professional learning was quite a long process and a very detailed process, and quite a challenging process, and met a lot of resistance. And I'll mention some aspects of that later on. But I want to briefly turn to the survey, just to pull out a couple of little points about it. So one of the things that we did with the survey was to ask teachers how they describe their own cultural background. Okay, now this is important because it actually hasn't really been done very well before, and there's an assumption that teachers are a very monocultural profession. Kevin hated this because we actually left it as an open-ended, open box in the survey, which is against the rules. And he said, but you can't kind of correlate it with anything else. And we said, we know that's the point. Okay, and so we asked that simple question and left it open, and we got a mess of things. Okay, and as I said, that was the point. So in the 5,128 responses, we got over 1,100 variations of response, okay? And that for us was really important. And so, and importantly, we fed this back into the professional learning process that happened, about a year after it, 6 months after it. And you could hear when we put that up in front of the teachers, you could hear this, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. So, this is a very small taste of the kinds of responses, and I just want to make a couple of points out of it. So leaving it open-ended, you get very particular versions of how people see themselves, okay? So the varieties of Australianness, which is not, I'm not going to talk a lot about now, but the varieties of Australianness alone are kind of interesting because you can see what people want to link it to, okay, and how they frame their understanding of what it means to be Australian. But I want to make a couple of points out of this. So the categories that people use to talk about themselves as teachers vary. So we have racial, in inverted commas, categories. We have categories of language, so people identify themselves in terms of language. We had faith, and we had region. So people said that I'm Middle Eastern, okay, which is kind of an interesting idea. Obviously, the most common categories were nationalities, nationality-defined ethnicity, okay, which is a problem in itself, but it's a very common and most typical way people have an understanding of their background. But the other thing is, if you look at something like the category of Chineseness, you get, again, a whole series of variations on that, okay? How people kind of articulate their Chineseness to something else and the specificities of where it comes from and so on and so forth. And then the last three, those last three are actual three people. They're individual people. So when they're asked to describe what they are, or how they identify, they run off a string of things, okay? So the point of this is to, one, that the teaching profession is not the monocultural thing that we kind of think it is, but actually contains within an enormous diversity. But also that this diversity captures something of the thing that we call cultural diversity in Australia, which is a messy kind of series of things. not at a series of discrete categories. But what we also, and it kind of equates with, I'm assuming that people know the debates around superdiversity that have come out of the UK, and the category of superdiversity, that we don't just have simply simple ethnic categories, category-defined communities anymore. We have much more complicated things going on. The term I like to use is hyperdiversity, simply because it captures the much more dynamic aspect of what happens when these processes take place. But it also poses the problem of identity as a category. When you ask somebody, say, what's your identity, where are you from, how do you categorise yourself, it's actually a mess, and that mess needs to be taken account of in something like multicultural education. And it also points not to categories of identity as representations, but the kinds of processes through which people's identity is formed. It's kind of built in there, but you can kind of see embedded in there little histories of where people have come from and where they're going and how they kind of think themselves at this particular moment. In the professional learning, we also throw up another PowerPoint which records the way teachers in the previous research that we've done talked about their students and the categories that they use. And that's them. Okay? So when they identify themselves, won't go back. What have I got to point it to? Anyway, you remember the last slide? Oh, there we go. So am I this morning. So when they talk about themselves, you get that. When they talk about students, you get that. Again, you can get a kind of a diversity, national categories, regional categories, language categories, and faith categories. But they're all singular, okay? There might be good reasons for that, but it's an interesting kind of thing. And when we show them that, the teachers gasp even more loudly, okay? So, as I said, we feed this, the kind of the data that we were kind of collecting back into the professional learning. So, that's the one thing from the survey that I wanted to talk about. But one of the things that we also did in the process was to actually ask people what they thought multiculturalism meant, okay? And this is the responses from students. I'm sorry that there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to go through every one, but I just want to give you a flavour of the kinds of responses because there's an important point here. Now, I should stress that I'm not claiming there's a right answer to this. There are some wrong answers, but there's probably not a right answer because, as I've indicated, multiculturalism is a kind of a complex idea which brings together a bunch of different things, okay? And the particular point that I want to make here is that people kind of go from seeing multiculturalism as being cultural diversity, the simple fact of cultural diversity, it just describes the fact that people have come here from lots of different places, towards certain kinds of imperatives or and dispositions about how we deal with, live in, manage that diversity. So people talk not simply about living together, but questions of acceptance and appreciation and embracing. And it's not just a mixing process, it's also a sharing process and a blending process which produces a harmonising for some people. So built into these kinds of responses is a whole bunch of things about what people think multiculturalism is and should be. Okay? And I left in the last quote there because of the nice kind of point that where you put them into a blender, sometimes you get it smooth and sometimes the chunks stay there, okay? Which kind of captures something or other, but anyway, so the point here is that multiculturalism actually means a bunch of things and the students' kind of responses recognise that. The teachers' responses there we go. Are pretty much the same, okay? And that's interesting because we had kind of assumed that teachers as professionals, where multicultural education had been central to the educational philosophy in Australia for 4 decades, may have had a different take, or perhaps a more formalised take on multiculturalism. In fact, they didn't. And they said much the same kinds of things. And almost as a kind of a mirroring of what the students said. And again, we fed that back into the professional learning to say, this is what you said about multiculturalism. We did a similar thing with the category of culture. Oop. Oh, this is one of Megan's slides, and she likes those silly. Slow down. Again, I'm not going to kind of go through every one, but again, you can see culture is we all know culture is a problematic word. Academics have spent eons talking about culture and still don't know what it is. But again, the students kind of offer a range of responses, beliefs, background, religion, nationalities, heritage, but it's also something that they do, or it's something that I do if I'm something like Greek. Teachers, again, actually don't vary very much in the students' responses, from the students' responses. And again, say, traditions, I don't know. It's what you do in your country. It's things like dance and music, or our Greek heritage. Well, the point that I like about that Greek culture one is that, in fact, it captures something about the problematics of change when people migrate here, that the Greekness here and the Greekness there don't actually necessarily match up. But the point here is again, the expectation that teachers as professional educators might actually have a different way of thinking about culture to their students, but they don't. And this kind of challenges the argument by Gert Bauman from the book Contesting Culture from 20 years ago, where he argued there was a kind of a distinction to be made between the dominant, or what I would call the official version of culture, versus the demotic, the popular, the everyday. In fact, we didn't find that. We found an enormous consistency between the ways people thought about things like culture and multiculturalism, a consistency across the categories of the sample, but an inconsistency within the definitions, a shared inconsistency. But a very common thing was to focus on the idea of culture as difference, and I'm sure you all kind of know that this has been discussed at length. And this comes from a discussion that Megan actually had with a group of primary school kids, where they kind of focus on culture as something that they do. And she says, well do I have a culture? And she looks angular. And this kid says, well, it depends. As you said, you were born in Australia, and if you have a culture, like, say, your parents were born in a different country, and then they had a culture, then their parents had a culture, so then you would have a culture because their parents have culture, and so do your grandparents. So you would have a culture because they are from a different country, or they were born in a different country. Okay. Now, this is interesting. First, because she sticks doggedly to the idea that culture must be difference. And you can only have a culture if you can kind of work out you've got a history of migration somewhere in the family. But I actually also like it because she's thinking. You can actually see this process of, if this is my starting point, where does it lead? Okay? And she has to kind of justify it. And for us as educators, that should be actually a really important point to take home. And I want to contrast to that the Anglo kid in a class where they're asked to do something, to talk about their culture, and she says, I don't have a culture, miss, I'm not different. Okay? So difference, as we know, has kind of become a central way of thinking about culture. Oh, now I've gone back too far. No? Oh, no. But in the RME project, we actually found some other interesting things about difference. And I want to kind of go through this because I'm digressing too much already. But in one school, when asked the kids to identify their cultural background, they gave single category answers, even though almost all of them were actually born in Australia. I'm Tongan, I'm Samoan, I'm Egyptian, I'm Mauritian and half Russian, I'm from Bangladesh, but I wasn't born here, I was born in New Zealand, I'm Bangladeshi too. Okay? So the nationally defined ethnicity was the way of thinking about culture. In contrast to this school, where they all gave the this and that answers. Okay? So identity and difference were being inflected slightly differently in two different school contexts. Why? We're not really sure, I can speculate, but I want to kind of then contrast it to this. When we asked them, why this particular school, why you're here, and it's because they're multicultural. Okay? And I am multicultural, I'm very multicultural, and my multiculturalism. Now, it's kind of cute and funny, But the question for me is, what are the contexts in which a child would say they are multicultural? That they would use that word to talk about their sense of who they are, okay? So we've got three different contexts: single category ethnicity defined by nationality, the hyphenation, or this and that, or the addition, whatever you want to call it, and the multicultural category. As I said, I can't answer that, but what it does is to suggest that the question of identity and what we have to do to think about how people come to define themselves in particular ways has to be thought through. It's not given, okay? And this should be the work of multiculturalism. So we use the category of schemas of perception, and we draw it from Bourdieu, and we kind of avoid categories of ideology and representation and so on and so forth, because we want to kind of talk about how these kinds of schemas of perception, the way we view ourselves and others, are built into kind of a larger a relational set of differences and so on, the ways of perceiving the world, which are a part of practice, not a kind of a separate category. And I don't want to kind of labour the theoretical point, but I do want to point out that these kind of schemas are not simply one-off representations of a people. They are this, they are that, but operate in particular kinds of ensembles of statements and ways of explaining the world. And I've picked a couple of the most egregious ones here because they kind of really stand out as being worth thinking about, what's going on in schools when people use these categories. So we have the example that the sad part about the Chinese community is that they have a programmed life without giving the children the opportunity of growing as rational, happy, contributing human beings. So Chineseness becomes part of a way of explaining them and explaining the world and thinking about embedded values about what schooling should and shouldn't be about. Okay? And the other example is about why the Arabic-speaking students don't do well is because cousins marry cousins, so their intelligence levels will be different. It's genetics. Okay, so they're the most egregious examples. I just picked them because I wanted to gasp. Okay, not everybody's saying that, but what it shows is that again, these categories are not just bland categories of I recognise you as this, but they participate in forms of explanation of the world, which should be the subject of inquiry. And I kind of like this one at the end because of a slightly different context where the student says, well, we don't really have many backgrounds in our school, which is a kind of a weird thing to say, but it's become part of the discourse in schools. We've just got like Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, just the general kinds of ones. Because we're all Asian here, we get along pretty well. We all come from the same background. So two things. The context in which Asian is normal, okay, which is quite different to some of the other schools, but also because the way she's internalised the idea that Chinese, Vietnamese and Indian are the same because they're all Asian. So the first points to the local context. At this school, Asian is normal. The second points to a larger, perhaps national context in which Asian has become a category by which you understand the bringing together of quite different kinds of nations, cultures, identities, whatever. And again, it should be that kind of thing should be this, subject to inquiry in multicultural education. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is kind of where I'm interested in thinking through these things, the circumstances in which differences get constituted, not just identities represented or cultures represented, but how does difference get constituted in places like schools, and how do these kind of identities travel across time and place, and how do we acquire them? And I want to kind of put that there, partly because I've talked about this in other circumstances, in other research with Lebanese migrants, and how one of the things that you do when you migrate here is you learn to be Lebanese, okay? And you learn to be Lebanese in quite a different way than you were Lebanese in Lebanon. And I've also talked about in an article I wrote some time ago in a geography journal about what happens when people actually refuse the categories that you recognise them through, which is kind of interesting thing as a researcher, but it also says something interesting about organisations and their cultures. But the point I want to make is that schools have a really important part to play in the fashioning of those senses of identities. They are part of a context where certain things get called upon to identify people. So schools aren't there to recognise and teach to the needs of these students because they're different. Schools actually help produce those differences. So I'll give you the example of Gary in a high school. He's of Tongan background, and he's involved in a very successful and popular program in his school where the Islander kids get pulled out and and do the haka, and it's great. It's a bit like Jonah, you know? Okay. So he talks about, but he actually says, actually, we're not very Tongan, I'm very Australian, really. And we point out, I said to him that, so do you do the haka at home? And he laughed and said, no, of course not. And I said, so you come to school to learn to do the haka and to find out about your culture? And he said, yeah. And he kind of paused and it kind of dawned on him that it was actually a really weird thing. So the school was doing the right thing in teaching to the needs of the student as it identified it, teaching it, allowing it to kind of maintain its culture. But the kid, it wasn't his everyday culture. So what's going on there in multicultural education that we think that's the right thing? Is it the right thing? Should we be doing something different? Should we actually be thinking about the tension in those two things? And the other point to make is simply that when you actually talk to people at length about their identities, you get narratives. You get stories about, heard about stories yesterday, but stories are not simply accounts of complex identities, they are histories of trajectories. So you get, when we ask people in the focus groups, as opposed to the survey, how do you talk about yourself? You get these kind of little narratives about, well, my parents did this and I did this and then we did that there and I learnt this and I dropped this and so on and so forth. And again, it speaks to a kind of a sense of time and space and the effects of globalisation that we should be fed into the processes of multicultural education, the kinds of tools that students need to make sense of those processes, not simply register the identities that they categorise, that are categorised through. Okay, so I took a bit longer on that than I intended. Sorry, but as I said, I digress a lot. I want to try and run through 3 case studies of schools, of the 14 schools, because they show different kinds of things. So as I said, we kind of set up this process, we challenged teachers, said, look, we think that the world looks a bit like this, okay? So how does your school respond to this and articulate its perception of its particular needs and challenges and the kinds of claims that we're making about the world? And I kind of say that about 1/3 of the schools got it and kind of ran with it. 1/3 of the schools kind of got it and didn't know what to do with it. And 1/3 of the schools just ignored us and did what they wanted to do anyway. Okay. We had done a pilot version of this, and where Megan and I had been much more involved in the development of the action research process in the schools. And the Department of Education had suggested that when we actually moved to the proper project, that she and I withdraw, that we set up the problem and then I kind of check in at various points to see how the thing was going and leave the ongoing management of the process to their consultants. And as you possibly know, the whole history of consultants, multicultural consultants in New South Wales, like elsewhere, is a sad and sorry history of underfunding and moving people out of positions. So this was kind of happening just as this process took place. But anyway, so we were actually removed from this. So the schools could kind of do what they wanted to do, but based on what we had challenged them to do. So I want to give you 3 case studies. The first is Eton, and they had a particular issue around high levels of truancy and absenteeism amongst Korean students. And they wondered if there was a difference in engagement and learning between Korean and non-Korean students at their school. Do Korean students have a preference for particular instructional strategies? And they wanted to identify to what degree the engagement of Korean students is affected by different pedagogical strategies, blah, 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 blah. So the problem. So the principal says, sorry, there's a slide missing there. So I'll tell you what the slide says. So the principal says, we've been struggling with our Korean community in particular, and that's, whether that's the boys or whether because of their Korean background, we're not sure. So, it's kind of set up as a problem that they're not quite sure what it means. But what they go through is they go through a kind of an information night with Korean parents. They bring in a community liaison officer, Korean background. They have presentations to staff and parents. They set up a homework club for Korean kids. They develop a system of peer mentoring, and they eventually introduced group-based learning. Oh. What? So now it's kind of doing weird things. Okay, so I don't want to stereotype too much. There would be a high level of compliance among most of our Laboat boys, but then you have a small percentage who are just totally intransigent. We've got 3 or 4 boys at the moment, all Korean, who are having meetings with the homeschool liaison officer, whether there's a problem of language issues or because they're not engaged. You've got to work out why that is. There's a broader question of cultural understanding, or what is it? There are 95 Korean boys in the school, 2/3 of whom were born in Australia. There are 22 in Year 9, but the problem is the 3 or 4 boys in Year 9 who are truanting. So there's a kind of a particular construction of the problem going on here. So even though the principal sets it up as a kind of an open problem, certain things are going on. And the deputy, who's a very experienced teacher in multiculturalism, multicultural education, who leads the team, and again he kind of sets it up, is it culture or is it something else? And then, as I was reading learning styles literature, yes, that's the Korean boys, that's the Korean boys, that's the Korean boys. Like, you told me something that was sort of stating the obvious, but it's nice when somebody's put it in print. So something happens in the process whereby the openness of the question becomes fixed because he's read some stuff on learning styles which says it must be the Koreanness of the boys that's the problem. Okay? And this is a short version of that process. It's kind of an interesting process. And part of that, and so they develop group-based learning strategies. They interview the boys about what they would like to do, and the boys say actually they like to work on their own sometimes, and they like to work with their mates sometimes. And then the teacher says what that means is Korean boys like to work with Korean boys, which is actually not what they say. Okay? And then the third thing is that they get their Korean teacher to come in and help solve the problem. Okay? She can talk their language, and she's also very assertive that they are Koreans and that they should be proud of that, and so she can use that as a Korean herself just to say, listen, you're letting the team down. It works extremely well. So there's a kind of the appeal to or a blaming of the culture in this process. So that you can see that what happens in this particular school in their action research project is the problem, quite complicated, actually becomes defined purely in terms of a particular category of ethnicity. Okay. Case study 2, multicultural cafes. In the school, this is one of the schools where they kind of got it and didn't know quite what to do with what we were saying to them. And sometimes I felt like we were setting schools up to fail, which might be kind of a problem of the structure of the project. But it was kind of interesting to see. It was an experiment to see, in a sense, how teachers as professional educators would run with a challenge. So in this particular school, they had a whole series of issues around racism, around lack of parent participation, and questions of engagement. So they have a multicultural roadshow, okay, which is kind of like their multicultural day, but in response to our critique of the multicultural day, okay. And so they have a series of rooms defined by a nation, and the year 3 to 6 students are set up as hosts, and they kind of run it and they do certain things, and the K to 2 kids, this is in primary school obviously, go as tourists and visiting each of the schools. And in the China room, there's a parent of Chinese background making dumplings. Chinese students are dressed in traditional national dress, and at the end of it they watch Mulan, okay? And they get these passports, and they have to have it stamped as they go from room to room. You can kind of see that the teachers are thinking, oh, globalisation, multicultural day in terms of globalisation. I don't know, we'll think about it as a kind of a process of going from country to country. Yeah? And they produce these beautiful signs. So each country was actually a cafe as well, which kind of is an interesting move in itself. And there's a menu, and the passport's in the middle of there, and the kids are in dress, and our professional job of disidentifying the students involved. It took ages to do that. And at the end they watched Mulan. Now, everybody loved it. They thought it was a huge success. And I don't want to suggest it wasn't a good thing in itself. But like the Multicultural Day, it's about producing a good feeling rather than thinking about what's going on here. And we think that, in fact, you could actually do a lot with an experience like this to actually turn it into not just the production of a good feeling about cultural difference, but a kind of interesting educational experience at various levels of the school. You could ask a whole series of questions around Mulan the movie. I mean, showing Mulan, a Disney movie, to represent Chineseness is a bizarre thing, okay? It should be something that kids could discuss. So how Chinese is Mulan when you've got Eddie Murphy and Pat Morita? The voices, the accents of the characters. Is it a Chinese movie? What's the relationship between nationality and culture if you're kind of going around doing your passports things? So as you can see, we think it wouldn't be hard to turn that into a different kind of experience or another kind of experience, apart from the feel-good one. But they were kind of stuck in this. They didn't know how to progress that far. So I want to talk briefly about the case study 3, where we think that they got it and they ran with it. And they didn't produce what we wanted them to produce, but they did something that actually worked for them. And so their issue was that they had a bunch of stroppy Indian parents who didn't like the way they taught maths. That's the real problem. They didn't turn that into the research question or the research context or the rationale, but that's what was going on. The Indian parents were coming in and saying, what you're doing is rubbish. We're taking our kids to tutoring on the weekends, okay? So they kind of talked about parental understanding of school approach to mathematics and teachers' understandings of students' family backgrounds. This is kind of the rewording of the project at the end of the process, okay? That kind of reflects where they kind of ended up kind of going. But it was interesting to watch them to rethink the project. Because initially what they were going to do was run a series of information sessions to parents to tell them why they're doing what they're doing, why it was a good thing, to explain it to them, because the problem was simply the parents didn't understand. But as the team leader kind of goes on to explain at some length, so we started exploring, and that was the way that our project was about. It was about us getting the parents to train the parents up. But through the process, we began to realise that, in a way, that was almost similar to what we were doing. We were again telling parents, and we were expecting them to change to meet what we expected. We began to realise that perhaps it needed to be halfway. We had to meet them halfway, and what really became apparent, that it was more about changing values. Well, not changing values, but understanding how values are really strong. You can't tell people to change something. It's not necessarily part of their values, and that by building a relationship, we began to understand what their values were. And the parents began to understand our values as a school. Now, I'm not going to kind of worry too much about the language of values and so on and so forth, but I want to use it simply to capture the way the team actually started to rethink what they were doing. And they changed the information sessions to start to think about the parents as intellectual resources for mathematical instruction and redefining parental involvement and engaging with parents in critical dialogue about mathematics education. And they read a lot about as I'll explain in a second, the Indian education system and to some extent the Chinese education system. And they end up with these 6 by 2 hour workshops with parents where they share different experiences in learning maths. Teachers and parents work through the syllabus together and then participate in maths problem-solving activities with their children. These parents go on to run the workshop with other parents. And in fact, it's still going. So of all the things that happened in the school, this is the one that's actually still going. I'm sure when they started it 4 years ago, I think. And it's kind of interesting to see it's now become a parent-run thing. Now, the significant thing is that what was really crucial was not simply our professional learning experience. I'd like to say that it was, but we certainly kind of put a worm in their heads. But the thing that really kind of did it was this reading about the Indian education system. So they didn't go off and read about Indian culture or learning styles. They actually went off to see what was the Indian education experience like, that these parents would say, we do it this way in our country and you do it this way. And the reading was kind of mind-blowing. This was I didn't actually mention that we actually gave all the teachers lending rights at our university for the duration of the project, which is a pretty unusual thing to do. I'm really surprised the university agreed to it. I think they forgot about it after a while, which meant that some of the teachers kept on using it even when the projects had finished. And in this case, the teachers actually came and talked to us about structuring the reading, because they kind of went online and thought, oh, damn, there's a lot of stuff here. But the reading was really important because it actually gave them an entree into where the Indian parents were coming from, not in terms of a claim about Indian culture, but in terms of the specificities of an educational experience that these parents had come from. And that produces a kind of a dialogue about sharing those experiences. The school can actually change the way it teaches mathematics in a really dramatic way because we're committed to curriculum. But it actually meant that the process of working with parents became a process of working with parents, not telling them what they had to do. And the interesting thing about this was that, in fact, the team actually started to think about culture differently. Now, these quotes read a little bit funny. Okay? Basically, these two women say, we became much more relaxed about the category of culture. We didn't worry about it. We actually started to talk to the parents, not as Indians. Now, it could sound like, in fact, they're somehow or other evading the question of ethnicity, but in fact they're not, because the program is still structured around working with Indian parents and their experience in education. But what, if I can reinterpret it, what they're saying is that, in fact, they stopped treating the parents as representatives of some kind of abstract category of Indian culture, with a set of values that did things in a particular way and, in fact, were a problem. They actually talked to them and talked about their competing experiences. So they stopped fetishising Indianness, if I can put it that way, and started to talk to parents of Indian background who had a particular educational experience. And so the process became much more open and much more provisional as dialogic. Now, I don't want to romanticise this, okay? I don't want to say this is beautiful and this is we've now reached a kind of world of cultural harmony, blah, blah, blah. All I'm saying is that this team changed what it was doing because it actually thought about what it should be doing, not just what it wanted to do. And then it made some shifts in how it worked with parents. And it's the process of shifting that's important, not some magical solution to how to do the things the right way in multicultural education. But where I want to end is to think about the professional ethos of teachers. Before people start kind of saying teacher bashing, the teachers themselves raised this issue in quite diverse ways. So I just want to throw up a series of comments. So we had one, the first quote is actually the guy from the Korean problem school, okay, who, even though he went off and read a couple of articles about learning styles, he actually said, I reckon all that reading, I don't know what the point of that reading was actually, that's all academic writing, we're all grassroots, we're things that happen every single day that we have to micromanage. I know that universities are driving the whole multicultural thing, teachers need to be in the classroom teaching. And this is a proponent of multicultural education. The things that we gave them to read were a summary from a UNESCO report on cultural diversity, it's written kind of in bureaucratic version of plain English, okay, but not academic. A descriptive article by Chris Inglis, who many of you will know, kind of talking about the history of multicultural education, so not theoretical. And a third piece, which some of the teachers kind of backed up against about, because it was a kind of a critical study in New Zealand about the implementation of multicultural education program in a particular school. But we didn't actually give them lots of reading, okay? And we actually bought their time out to do it. So we were kind of prepared, but still slightly overwhelmed by the resistance to reading, to the task of doing the reading, particularly from somebody who was a committed multiculturalist. Okay. So, and so some of the teachers kind of talked about, oh, maybe it's because teachers aren't entering the profession thinking of themselves as professionals, it's viewed as a job. This person says, it's one of the reasons why I chose teaching, because I thought it would fit into my lifestyle. Okay. And then she goes on to say, but I learned to enjoy it. But enjoying teaching is not quite the same as having a very strong commitment to a particular, vision of what learning is about, I don't think. And she was one of the teachers who resisted the reading. And in fact, their school almost pulled out of the project after they came to the first professional learning session. And then the last quote, I think that most teachers don't see themselves as academics. We had to do a degree to get the job, that's all in the past, and we got the qualification. So we want to argue that there's something going on in the professional culture of teaching that produces these kinds of responses, which produces the kinds of intransigence about a much more critical engagement with questions of multiculturalism in multicultural education. Yeah? That's the link that we're making. And I want to insist it's not teacher bashing in the sense that I want to say these teachers are bad teachers. It's something about the system that we've got in place which produces teachers in a particular way and doesn't actually take them elsewhere in their professional careers. And I want to kind of link it back to one other thing from the survey, okay, which is kind of telling, in that when we asked teachers a whole bunch of questions, what the goals of multicultural education were, what you think the highest priorities were, and we asked them, what can schools do to foster inclusiveness? The single most important or popular response was still the multicultural day. Okay? And I think this kind of links to the question of the professional ethos issue, because it's really about adopting a particular way of thinking about multiculturalism, which is relatively easy. I'm not saying it's not hard work, but it's relatively easy as an intellectual task, a celebration of particular kinds of differences. And some of the other tasks are much harder. And that's not to say that teachers were entirely happy with this, what we call lazy multicultural education in another paper. There was a lot of questioning going on. So we have a teacher here who says, well, we all just get happy on Multicultural Day. Personally, I don't think that it works. I don't think the kids of a young age understand. They think it's just a day of food. It was fun. They enjoyed it. Sense of community. But in terms of an actual lesson being taught from it, no. Okay? So it's not as though the teachers don't know. Some of the teachers don't know that there's something more going on, but they don't quite know where to go with it or what to do, or something about the culture of the school doesn't allow them to go there. And we want to kind of make this argument about the prevalence in multiculturalism, what we call an unreflexive civility. Okay? And by that I mean there's still a lot of civility in the way people think about multiculturalism. It's about the respect for difference, about the recognition of notions of difference based on categories of nationality, defined ethnicity. But what it does is to emphasise a celebratory mode of multiculturalism, or multicultural recognition, symbolised by the Multicultural Day. And it overstates the moral imperative to respect cultural groups and their values and customs at the expense of a deep understanding of the social practices and relations which lie behind the kinds of things that I was showing with questions of identity. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon respect, be clear about that. I'm just saying that we have overemphasised kind of the moral dimensions of the category of respect at the expense of an intellectual engagement with the issues which produce categories of difference in culture and ethnicity and the processes which underlie them. So it's unreflexive civility. I'm nice, I respect you, I think your culture is wonderful, and I go to your restaurants and all that kind of thing. But no one actually thinks much about the complex histories and trajectories, social relations, structures of power, blah, 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 behind or underneath or producing those categories. And it's buttressed by what we've said is the professional ethos. And this second half of the PowerPoint is actually a summary of the article that we gave teachers to read by Tim Pilley and Robinson. I don't know whether any of you know it. It's a very good little kind of essay on some research into a school in New Zealand about what seems to be good intentions by a school to produce multicultural education, but caught up in certain types of problems around what they call the professional ethos. So this ethos of collegial autonomy discourages critically reflective evaluation of practice. It's always about moving on to the next thing. Don't criticise your colleague. Say, it's wonderful, let's do the next thing. And it rests on compartmentalised thinking and a resistance to thinking systemically beyond the demands of the classroom. It encourages a feel-good orientation towards colleagues, misconstruing critique as criticism, and hesitant to engage in practice which challenges. And it also produces a good feeling towards students through the process of recognising their difference. So, do we forget about multicultural education? No, we need to reflect upon the forms of identification that all of us participate in. Okay? Think about the forms of complexity reduction we engage in to make sense of classroom diversity and the limitations of this. So we reduce people to particular kinds of categories to make schools an easier place to be. Okay? Get all the Pacific Islander kids together and give them a community language class, even though they don't speak the same language, because it seems to be recognising their Pacific Islanderness. Okay? Engage critically with the cultural dynamics of the contemporary world and assist students to do the same. And refocus on the intellectual capacities students need to reflect upon a culturally complex world. And therefore that means refocus on the teacher as an intellectual. And I want to quote Raywin's, I hope many of you know this quote, where Raywin says, interpreting the world for others and doing it well requires not just a skill set, but also a knowledge of how interpretation is done, of the cultural field in which it's done, and the possibilities of interpretation that surround one's own. The requirement helps to define teaching as intellectual labour and teachers as a group of intellectual workers. Now, each time we talked to teachers, and we ran this argument, we had about a 50-50 kind of breakdown of laughter. So when we told teachers that they should think of themselves as intellectuals, many of them laughed. Okay? So something is going wrong here in our training of teachers where they go to university, supposedly trained as professional educators. Education is an intellectual task, not just the other things that it is. It's fundamentally an intellectual task, and teachers don't think of themselves as being part of that chain of intellectual production, of intellectual labour. In fact, they laugh at the fact. I think that's a problem. And it's a particularly problem for multicultural education. And as I've said, what's happened is that we rest on categories that are problematic and don't explore the processes by which those things come to be, and the relations and practices and structures, power and so on and so forth, that make the world what it is. So I would suggest that multicultural education needs to... it's not about turning teachers into academics. Okay? We're not trying to do that. Just become just like me and you'll be right, okay? That's not the point. The point is that you're professional educators, which means that you have to grasp the intellectual component of what you're doing and take it seriously in terms of whether you're dealing with a kindergarten kid or an HSC kid. And it needs to be applied to multiculturalism in a particular way. And I don't have the quote up here, but the team leader from the school that did the community learning program actually had this really nice comment where he said, the professional learning was important here because normally you go along and it's about somebody else telling you what the answer is, and then you kind of go away and you kind of apply it. And that our professional learning was quite good for him, not some other teachers, because we actually didn't tell him what the answer is, we just asked really difficult questions. And we said that you had to think about how you would address these in your particular school context. And so he said we actually had to go off and talk about it and think about it and reflect upon it and work out what we thought the problem really was. And we thought that in a nutshell was in fact what reflexive civility of multicultural education and the professional practice of teachers should be. So I'm going to skip the last, second last slide because it's actually a bit of, I haven't really solved this problem yet, so just close your eyes quickly, that one. And so I can go straight to the plug for the, from the website and the book, which should come out sometime next year. Thank you. Thank you. Ooh, that was very formal. Handshake. Oh, thank you very much.
You really want that glass of water, don't you?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.